All right. Well, I think we are going to go ahead and get started. And I want to say welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today for this wonderful event on a really critical issue. Clean energy infrastructure, environmental justice, and community needs. These are a set of issues that really will frame a number of our key priorities as we move forward in addressing the climate crisis and meeting our energy needs. And so I am so happy to be here with you all for this event and for what I think is going to be a wonderful discussion. I also want to thank MCAN's partner in this work, Prince Lobel, for your incredible partnership in putting this event together. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Logan Malik, and I am the outgoing Executive Director of the Massachusetts Climate Action Network, or MCAN, and we are a statewide climate advocacy organization founded back in 2000, committed to building a just and equitable fossil-free future for all of our communities across the Commonwealth. And we do that through empowering communities, engaging people, and mobilizing action. So before we jump into the panel, I'm just going to give you all a bit of some housekeeping information. First and foremost, please do make sure to mute yourself or keep yourself muted in the event that you can unmute yourself. We are and will be recording this webinar, so please also make sure that you we'll be sure to kind of to send out the recording, but also if you're keep your screen off in the event that is a concern for you. The other thing is we will have time at the end for questions and answers. So if you have any questions that you'd like to share throughout the event, please do put it in the chat. There is no guarantee that we'll be able to get to it, but we will do our very best. As far as the agenda for today's discussion, we are after these remarks, we are going to be having opening comments from our speakers, and we may shift the order slightly, but it should be each panelist will have the opportunity to spend some time kind of talking about these issues and how they overlap. We'll then get to have a panel discussion with a combination of questions that we have and that we want to address, as well as your own questions. So please do make sure that you are asking your questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And then we'll just have some brief concluding remarks. That should kind of close things up. With that being said, I don't want to I do not want to hold things up and keep us away from the discussion. So I am going to go ahead and jump right into things and to our first speaker. And I think we're going to change up the order just a little bit. And if it's all right, we'll start with Chief Hoffer. And just a brief introduction of the climate chief. Melissa Hoffer is Massachusetts's first climate chief in history. In this role, the chief leads the Office of Climate, Innovation, and Resilience and is focused on harnessing all of the resources and authority available to the governor and to the executive department to advance the Commonwealth's climate innovation, mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency policies. She joined, prior to this role, the Biden administration as a day one political appointee and served as the acting general counsel and principal deputy general counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency. And prior to that, she worked in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office here at home in our state, serving as both the chief of the Environmental Protection Division and the chief of the Energy and Environment Bureau. So we are so very grateful to have you here, Melissa. And with that, I will go ahead and let you take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Logan. Good morning, everybody. And it's really a pleasure to be here today with my colleagues, my current colleagues and former colleagues, and of course with John Walkey, who I've known for the better part of 20 years. So it's just a wonderful panel, and I'm very pleased, and I appreciate Logan and also Richard for inviting us here. So thank you, and it's a wonderful turnout. Before I dive into my remarks for today, I do want to make sure to take a moment just to acknowledge what we have seen unfolding across the globe over the past 2 months. And I think that, we already know, and people on this call are probably paying very close attention and tracking, but if it wasn't clear before, it's very clear now that climate change is already a deeply urgent problem that's affecting each and every facet of our lives, and that's going to continue. And just because of the duration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is, effectively locked in on the order of centuries once it's emitted, we're going to be dealing with this for a long time. And so what that means is really making sure that while we remain very focused on mitigation, we are amplifying our efforts to make our communities more resilient, make sure people understand what's coming, make sure they understand that we're going to be dealing with resilience and learning how to adapt to these changed climatic conditions while we are also working to deeply decarbonize in a dramatically short time period. I think folks have probably tuned into it, but there are just a couple high points I want to make. NASA has reported that June was the hottest month on record globally since records have been being kept. Surface ocean temperatures in June 2023 also set the record for the highest reported in the month of June. If you're tracking those data, you can see how incredibly anomalous they are. Both the extent of Antarctic sea ice is lowest on record, Arctic sea ice well below the average for 1990 through 2000. So these are big sort of vital signs for the health of our planet and our climate. We've seen, multiple marine heat waves unfolding. These have, incredible implications, not only for, for fisheries, but also just for the marine sea life that are living in those areas. If you track University of Maine's Climate Change Institute, Earth broke the unofficial temperature record on July 3rd. That was the hottest day in 120,000 years. And of course, that record quickly fell on July 4th. That was an even hotter day. And then the record broke again on July 6th, which was a hotter day still. So, we had those 3 days in that first single week of July were the hottest that the Earth has experienced in 120,000 years. And, these things really add up to stories. These numbers are overwhelming sometimes to take in, but just to think about how they're playing out on the human scale, with Western Mass and Vermont experiencing, these unprecedented flood events. About 1,000 acres of farmland in Massachusetts were underwater, expecting maybe to see that climb with some of the additional rain. Our agricultural commissioner reported that the recent flooding might have caused more than 10 million in damages and crop loss. And I think we have about 75 farms that lost their crops for the season. And being the time of year that it is, they can't replant. So these things are hitting close to home as we see them unfolding nationally and of course internationally with some of the incredible heat dome and impacts that's having in China and Europe, and the intense flooding that we've seen in India. And of course, again, with the massive, really unconceivably large forest fires that are happening in Canada. And we've all felt the impact of that in terms of the particulate matter emissions this summer. So I just wanted to frame that as an acknowledgement of the acceleration and the intensity of the climate impacts that we are seeing, and to register that we understand that and we are taking that into account in state government here. So with that, I want to tell you just a little bit about, with that context, the Climate Office, a little bit about why we have it and how it's working. And then I wanted to just talk through some of our major accomplishments in the first 6 months. So, why have a Climate Office? It is the first cabinet level climate position in the United States. And it's not like Massachusetts didn't have very, very good and very forward-looking climate legislation on the books already. We had Global Warming Solutions Act, a Green Communities Act. These were passed in 2008. They were at that time just among a handful of similar statutes across the country. But the reality is the climate change is not just an environmental issue. So typically, climate has kind of been relegated to the environmental agencies, and that's been true both at the state level and at the federal level. So you see that issue kind of playing out, in the agencies that deal with energy and environment. They haven't really been owned as much by Health and Human Services, if you will, or HUD, or Department of Transportation. So when the Biden administration came in, we created the Office of Domestic Climate Policy and put Gina McCarthy in the lead on that. And then, the role of that office was to really integrate climate policy across the federal agencies. So, we have a very robust version of that here, established by Executive Order 604, which the governor signed, the first official act after being sworn in as governor back in January. And the notion is that we are injecting climate into the DNA of every state agency, and that each of the secretaries owns it. So a couple of the secretariats, most of the folks on this call probably know, have specific, mandated obligations. EEA, DOT, for example, under the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, which is developed pursuant to the Global Warming Solutions Act and later pieces of legislation that amended that act. But some of the other agencies have obligations to develop policy that's consistent with the administration's policy direction and policy initiative. And there's been an enormous amount of energy and excitement around that as we start to look at, obviously it's a public health issue. And we have Secretary Walsh, who comes from doing tremendous work at Boston Medical Center, making sure that that facility was reducing its own emissions and beginning to think about how to address climate change as it comes up in the healthcare space. So how do we do it? We do it by virtue of a framework where we establish a Secretary Climate Officer at each of the agencies. And it's that person's job. These were not new hires, but these are folks who were interested in climate change or knew a little bit about it and had a command or expertise in the subject matter and the mission of their agencies. So those folks have been working very closely with us. We had them all in place by February and have helped us analyze, the policies that they're looking at, what could be done, help us think about gaps. And some of that work now has been rolled into the recommendations that we provided to the governor just about a week ago, pursuant to the executive order. Our office was obligated to review current climate policy across all of the agencies and then make recommendations. So that's, a formal framework for working across agencies. And when it comes to sort of naturally cross-cutting things like workforce development and economic development, Climate Office has been involved in helping to ensure that we're putting those groups together, that they've got a climate lens on them, and that we are working to ensure we've got clear goals in place, metrics, and ways of ensuring that we're actually doing what we need to do when it comes to growing our already robust clean energy sector, and when it comes to ensuring that we're thinking about climate change in everything that we're doing on economic development as well. So we're kind of the connective tissue. That's probably a good way to think about it in ensuring that we're talking about climate. We hold a climate cabinet once a month with all of the secretaries. So the cabinet meets weekly with the governor, and we meet on a monthly basis with the secretaries themselves, and we've used that time to talk about our work, share what we're doing, and we've also had experts come in from outside the office to advise us on the relationship between climate and mental health, for example. And tomorrow we have folks coming in to talk to us a little bit more about financial risk and climate change. So that's a little bit about what we've been doing, and I want to just review quickly with you some of our accomplishments, because we have been very proud of that, and we've been working really hard on those things. So back in June, one of our proudest accomplishments, we announced the creation of the Massachusetts Community Climate Bank. That's our very first green bank in the whole country that's going to be dedicated to affordable housing. So when we're thinking about environmental justice and the theme of today's meeting, that's a really big one, because, you know, the 4 basic pillars of the clean energy and climate change are to decarbonize the power sector. And when I say decarbonize, I mean, obviously get rid of the fossil fuels. Decarbonize the building sector, so that means moving us off of fossil-based heating fuels. Decarbonizing the transportation sector, again, moving away from fossil-based transportation fuels. And then reducing actual carbon dioxide emissions in the air through sequestration. So that's going to involve preserving, you know, our forests and our wetlands and our coastal marshes, which do a lot of work in terms of drawing down carbon and sequestering it. So when we think about the climate bank, the thing that was most important to us is we wanted to focus on low income and affordable housing first, and make sure that as we go in there and we do the retrofits, where we are going to be improving building envelopes, improving energy efficiency, getting electric air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps as the situation may call for. When we're getting those installed, we're going to do that. And that's going to really improve quality of life for people. And it's going to have a beneficial health outcome. I was just at the Federal Reserve for a conference in New York, and it was very interesting to me to hear from advocates in Baltimore. And when they are going in and retrofitting low-income housing, they are finding enormous health benefits in the form of reduced asthma incidents, for example. And so they're actually been able to go to Medicaid and get some reimbursement for those retrofits that can then help fund further decarbonization. So we're looking, we're trying to bring a systems thinking approach when we choose these advocacy options. And then we're also really looking for the interventions that bring the greatest co-benefits in terms of public health. Just a couple other quick accomplishments. We launched in June our Forests as Climate Solutions Forestry Initiative. That's going to expand our existing state programs, invest in forest conservation, enhance our network of forest reserves, develop forest management guidelines based on the latest climate science. That's the key sort of heart of this initiative, is to make sure we're incorporating the best climate science into all of our work on forests. And a part of this is we paused all harvest in state-owned forests while we get this process together, except for the ones that were already under contract. And we appointed a body of scientists who can help advise us on how to undertake the integration of climate science in that space. Secretary Tepper, as you know, has announced the establishment of a commission on clean energy infrastructure siting and permitting. So that will be established, I think, soon by executive order. And then that body will be making recommendations to us on siting our energy infrastructure and permitting. MassDOT has put in place a climate program management office, or a PMO. If you're familiar with those, that's a very specific management structure that will apply to all of DOT and will be specifically oriented to DOT's accomplishment of its obligations to integrate climate change and its specific mandates on the clean energy and climate plan. So I could go through many more of these, but that gives you some sense of what we've been up to, and I'm happy to take questions on it. And with that, I'm going to stop so we can hear from everyone else and then get to your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful, Chief Hoffer. Thank you so much for that helpful overview of the critical work that the office is doing under your leadership. I think it provides a helpful overview and can allow us to then narrow down towards the critical question of siting and of clean energy infrastructure and kind of what this all means. And to do that, I am going to pass it to our next panelist, and that is Richard Kanoff. Richard is a partner and the chair of Prince Lobel's Renewable Energy Industry Group. He has devoted his career to helping private and public clients understand and navigate the often complex world of Energy, Climate Change, Innovation, and Technology. And as part of this, Richard works with a diverse group of emerging and established private and public companies, startups, nonprofits, individuals, and municipalities, and focuses on renewable energy, clean technology law, which includes regulatory policy, litigation. The list goes on. And I have to say, he has been a fantastic partner for MCAN, both in this event and in our regular advocacy work. So with that, Richard, I will go ahead and let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Logan, for that kind introduction. I see a lot of familiar faces, even though they're very tiny here. And I want to welcome everyone to this impressive forum. I want to initially set the table and set a few things out right away. First, we're mindful, all of us, of the need to get to net zero by 2050. As Melissa noted, the planet is heating up, and there's a lot of urgency around our need to improve our infrastructure to meet that concern. Some commentators believe that we have to expand our energy infrastructure by, depending who you listen to, by up to 3 times what is now installed in order to electrify and enhance our distribution system resources. In addition, we're going to hear today about how important environmental justice is. There's significant new mandates regarding impacts on environmental justice communities, and those need to be paid attention to, and they're going to be an important part of our energy future as well. And as Melissa's and Maria, which we'll hear from in a few minutes, demonstrate, we have a new administration focused on developing and implementing climate change related policies and addressing environmental justice, community impacts, and inequities. We're delighted to have that voice today. And we're also delighted to have our Attorney General here, not the Attorney General, but a representative of the Attorney General's office, Turner Smith, to express how the Attorney General is focused on outreach and advocacy in support of effective climate change related outcomes. And we look forward to hearing from her later. As some additional context, I just want to point out that the siting process is often criticized as too slow, not focused or designed to develop infrastructure to meet the renewable energy future. Some folks say there's a need for speed, a faster process is required now. In a similar vein, some commentators suggest that advocates, stakeholders in cities and towns don't understand. They don't understand what's required for the future. They don't understand how to expand the system to meet climate change realities. Having represented stakeholders in cities and towns, and many of you here, I just want to reiterate, we get it, we understand. We appreciate Melissa's remarks, and we're going to talk about some of this today. I think we could all agree on some fundamental facts, which I want to briefly lay out. One, there's a lot of successful development. Solar has gone off the charts, offshore wind is developing, siting and permitting of renewables is possible, has been successful, and needs to continue. Two, there's a need to expand some electric infrastructure and interconnection and to phase out gas as a fuel. Three, siting policy has to encourage good choices for infrastructure development, and it has to respect environmental justice communities. Four, energy infrastructure development requires an effective process to weed out bad choices. Bad choices, whether fast or slow, are still bad choices. With climate change, bad choices will cook the planet, overburden impaired communities, and are not helpful. And finally, we can agree there's significant room for improvement in the current system of permitting and siting energy infrastructure, in the way we respect environmental justice communities, and the way in which our cities and towns are partners in the process. Unfortunately, there's examples that support the view that the current system has lost its balance, and I want to briefly talk about these. For example, the Peabody Peaker project, which was a proposal to improve and develop a fossil fuel peaker in an environmental justice area in 2021-22. It's under construction now. Enough said, really. Fossil, environmental justice. The Sudbury transmission line, a utility ignored the wishes of 4 towns to locate a line under street instead of on an undeveloped right-of-way. Weymouth, an admittedly unnecessary compressor station. East Boston, does the substation really have to go there? And Long Meadow, Springfield, a proposal for a redundant and wholly unnecessary gas line with environmental justice implications. And from the not too distant past, as kind of a context, we have the Northeast Energy Direct Project, an interstate pipeline, which was for the most part approved in Massachusetts. And but for New Hampshire's opposition, New Hampshire was a bridge too far for this project. It may have gone forward, but it didn't. It died, fortunately, and was rescinded by the developer. I'm not going to get into some of these more specifically because some are still pending. Matters are under litigation. All of these projects carry lessons and cautionary tales. Fundamental to the process is the need for developers and regulators to listen. In all of these cases, important concerns from cities and towns and stakeholders were not heard, and different points of view and detailed suggestions and experts were ignored, often suggestions that would get the projects built faster. In some cases, advocates were not allowed to intervene and participate in the process at all. Meaningful dialogue and participation is key, and that's my message. We need to create a mechanism for meaningful dialogue early in the process where the views of advocates, cities and towns, and stakeholder groups are heard, not a box to be checked off, but heard and appreciated and valued. Perhaps a system which requires a formal discussion prior to the filing or consideration of any project for regulatory approval, not a checklist of community meetings, but a meaningful back and forth of views, point and counterpoint, a recognition that it is better to develop a project that represents a consensus of developer and stakeholder and municipal views with full consideration of environmental justice implications, even if it costs a bit more, than to insist on a project that will result in a contested development. Community engagement does not slow projects down. Let me say that again. Community engagement does not slow projects down. Significantly too, there may be projects that are not needed at all at any cost, and these views should be respected and taken to heart at the get-go as well. So let's listen and have a meaningful dialogue today. And here to help us with a better path forward is our esteemed panel. I turn this back to Logan to introduce our next speaker. Thank you, Logan.
Thank you so much, Richard, for those comments and for your partnership and work in this space. And I think, you set the table very nicely in highlighting, a direction that we can move forward on. It's always helpful to hear from the folks who are kind of involved and ingrained in some of these very complicated questions in government. And of course, one of those includes our new Undersecretary, Maria Belen Power. And so I'm going to pass it over to her next as a quick introduction. Undersecretary Power serves as the first Undersecretary of Environmental Justice and Equity. In this role, she oversees the training of the EEA agency staff and focuses on establishing environmental justice principles in the work of the Secretariat. She also works with external stakeholders on community outreach and engagement to ensure that historically marginalized communities are represented as the Healey-Driscoll administration advances its energy and environmental agenda. Prior to her role, Undersecretary Power served as the Assistant Executive Director of Greenroots, and in her current role and her prior role has been a fantastic partner for MCAN and so many others. So we're so grateful to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Logan, and thanks for having me. Thank you to MCAN for the invitation. First, I do want to congratulate Alicia Flood for her new role as the Executive Director of MCAN, and we're super excited and really looking forward to working with you. Like Logan said, my name is Maria Belen Power, and I am originally from Nicaragua. I grew up in Central America and came to the US for college. And really my background is in communities, in environmental justice communities, and in doing grassroots organizing and building power in low-income communities and communities of color. So, as you all very well know, environmental justice is really about the people. It is about civil rights, and it is about Black, Brown, immigrant, Indigenous, and low-income communities, and those are located all over the Commonwealth, not just in the greater Boston area, but in every single corner of our state. There are communities, low-income communities, communities of color that are suffering the impacts of the climate crisis. And really, it is also about protecting those communities that have suffered from the negative consequences and from the public health impacts of the energy infrastructure and of so many infrastructures that we have built for the need of everyone. But those who have carried the burden have historically been people of color and low-income communities. And so, we need to take a real close look at how we engage folks and how can we do that through an equitable process. I've seen the process happen before, and I've seen it how it could be exclusive and it could exclude, right, the folks that have been the most impacted. And we need to make sure that those processes are different and that we are changing the way we engage folks. At the same time, we need to move intentionally, right, and with the urgency that we need in order to transition to clean energy. So there is urgency, like was said before, but we need to do it with intentionality, and we need to really move at the pace of trust, so that those two aren't opposites, right? Like we can move fast and we can also move with intentionality and having folks at the table shaping the solutions. But it is also more than process, right? It is not just having more and more meetings. It is about those voices actually shaping the outcome and ensuring that there's a just transition for everyone, in particular the communities that have carried the brunt and suffered the impacts, the negative impacts from it, the environmental investments, industrial investments, energy investments that we have made and that we all have benefited from. Under the Healy-Driscoll administration, we really are doing things differently. We are, in a way, recalibrating the way we do this work. This work is systemic. It is long-term. It is sort of the long-haul commitment of working for justice. And what we're doing is we're working to embed environmental justice into the way we operate in every single office and in every single agency under our secretariat. And like I said, it is as much about process as it is about outcome. And it is, environmental justice communities will have and already have a seat at the table. And so it is, like I said, about process, but also about the outcome and how are those voices shaping the outcome. My colleague, Undersecretary Judge, like Chief Hoffer mentioned, will be convening the Siting Commission, which will kick off later this summer. And one of the main tenets of that commission is to be inclusive. So the commission will help guide the Commonwealth on streamlining and expediting processes, right, for clean energy. And we are addressing the urgency with intentionality. The commission will include environmental justice voices and a seat for Indigenous representation. When it comes to MEPA, the Environmental Policy Act, we at EEA are really working hard and looking closely at the MEPA office and really at the filings that are coming to ensure that environmental justice is being considered. Every single project that triggers the environmental justice protocols has to go through a full analysis of impact, not just in regards to community outreach, but really they need to provide a formal analysis and a substantive analysis on the impact. And the purpose is really to avoid and mitigate any disproportionate effect on environmental justice population. With the most recent environmental justice protocols issued in 2022, around 60% of new MIPA filings trigger the new requirement. So it's a huge, right, part of the new filings that are coming in, and we're taking it very seriously. And while MIPA is not a permit, it is a certificate, and it is a certificate that is needed to move forward, and a very important step in the approval process for these projects. So, we're taking a very close look, and we're working really to improve and strengthen MIPA. Our goal is to protect environmental justice communities, those who have, been disproportionately overburdened by the energy infrastructure, and really to undo the harm that we have historically caused in Black and Brown and low-income communities. So as we transition to a new renewable energy system, we will need additional infrastructure. I mean, there is no doubt about that. We will need new infrastructure. And the key question we are actively trying to answer and answering is, how do we do that? And how do we do this work in a way that does not create additional harm on Black, Brown, Indigenous, immigrants, and low-income communities? So my office is convening 3 very critical bodies that will work to embed environmental justice principles, both internally and externally. So the Environmental Justice Council, which has been meeting already, is an external body of EJ leaders and advocates that are appointed and confirmed by the governor. We are convening our 10th public meeting for September, and the meeting is tentatively being planned to happen in Lynn with a virtual option. Now, the Environmental Justice Task Force is the second body, and this is an internal task force under EEA that includes designees, folks that are designated from each office and agency, which are 12 altogether. So 12 agencies and offices under EEA. And the group has already been doing the work, the internal work of developing their own internal EJ strategy. And so right now we are taking the comments that were submitted from the public. We are reviewing them, responding to the comments, and incorporating those into what will be the final environmental justice strategy. And that includes offices and parts of the secretariat like DPU and MIPA. So those 2 very critical offices in regards to energy infrastructure are also taking this very seriously and incorporating environmental justice into their strategy. And we hope, I mean, so in the process right now, we are all taking comments and responding to comments. So we hope that the final EJ strategy will be finalized by the end of the summer. And this will really be our guiding document on how each agency will incorporate and will operationalize environmental justice. Because like I said, it's not just about community engagement, right? It's not just about having more meetings, but it's about shaping the outcome of those meetings and of that engagement. The third one is the Interagency Working Group. And this is a cross-secretariat body with appointees from each secretary. And in coordination with the Climate Office, this body will be convening very soon. And the work will be to ensure that we are taking a whole of government approach and that we are addressing environmental justice, not just under our Secretariat of EEA. We know very well that residents across the Commonwealth do not live single issue lives. And so we all live intersectional lives, and we all must ensure that environmental justice is addressed across all secretariats in an intentional and intersectional way. And with that, I'll pass it back to Logan, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary Power. I think, that emphasis on process is so important. as is that, the incredible progress that is being made. I love the mention of MIPA and the, the tangible impact that these laws are having. So thank you, and thank you for all of your work and your partnership. I want to talk. I want to turn it over to our next panelist, who we are delighted to have, and that is Turner Smith, who serves as the Deputy Chief of the Attorney General's Office's Energy and Environment Bureau. And this bureau is focused on protecting utility ratepayers and our environment and reducing the threat of climate change for the people of Massachusetts. Prior to this role, Turner served as the Deputy Division Chief of the Environmental Protection Division in the Attorney General's Office, where she litigated state and federal enforcement cases, defended state agency actions, and supervised the division's multi-state advocacy on federal regulatory and policy matters. She has been with the Attorney General's Office since 2013, which means she has a whole bunch of knowledge and insight into the office's working and the priorities. And so we're so grateful that you're here to share some of that knowledge with us today. And I will give the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Logan. Thank you for having me. I'm super honored to be here with this group of panelists. Everyone on this webinar have been extremely valued partners in our work in my time at the AGO. And I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces in the audience. This is just an amazing turnout to talk about a topic that couldn't be more important. So, these are the issues that keep us up at night. They certainly keep me up at night. And I'll say that particularly this month, as Melissa alluded to, or Chief Hoffer alluded to, our kids can't play on the playground, and we're seeing our future play out in real time. And we are also seeing that these burdens are continuing to disproportionately impact that people that have been historically marginalized across Massachusetts, across the country, across the world. We're at a crossroads because we need to do something about this. We need to install just a crazy amount of infrastructure to make that happen. And it's not just, mitigation, clean energy infrastructure, it's also infrastructure for adaptation. But we also need to make sure that that doesn't fall on the shoulders of the people who've, been disproportionately burdened by energy infrastructure and other environmental harms over the years, and the people who've been underserved over and over again by their representatives. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the work of our office, just to sort of lay out how our Energy and Environment Bureau functions, the types of work that we do, and then I'll discuss some of the ways in which we've prioritized environmental justice, particularly in the last several years. And I'll dig in with some details on our stakeholder advocacy and energy proceedings, which I think are particularly relevant to this discussion, and then some relevant state and federal policy advocacy. So our Environmental Protection Division, I'll start there, is led by Betsy Harper and Lou Dundon. The division enforces about 24 state environmental laws. It's long been a leader on the federal side of things as well, advocating for federal greenhouse gas policy, among many other topics. And that led to the Massachusetts versus EPA Supreme Court decision, and that work continues to this day. We also often defend state agency decisions or policies, for example, the state's declining cap on greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. Over the last several years, as I mentioned, we've really focused on weaving extensive community engagement into every aspect of our work. The Energy and Telecommunications Division, or ETD, led by Liz Anderson and Matt Saunders. The division is the statutory ratepayer advocate for the Commonwealth in rate proceedings for the DPU and FERC. And this is a really important really unique and important role. And candidly, I'm fairly new to my role in the office, and so I've been drinking from the fire hose on the ETD topics, and it couldn't be more fascinating and more compelling. The division advocates essentially for low costs in electricity and gas proceedings, and as we all know, that's particularly important in years like this, where we've seen record-setting electric bills and gas bills. ETD has also led the charge in investigating competitive electric suppliers, so people who send you mailers knock on your doors with false promises of energy savings and clean energy. We also have an environmental crimes strike force, which is led by David Clayton, and that the strike force brings criminal cases for particularly egregious violations of environmental laws, those with serious potential for harm. So turning to environmental justice and community engagement at the Attorney General's office, I just want to start by saying that our team has done a lot of internal work in recognizing that environmental justice work is bigger than just environmental impacts, but really implicates the whole holistic environment where people live and work and play. And addressing those issues holistically is a real team effort and cross-cutting effort. It's going to require cross-division work, cross-bureau work, cross-office work at the AGO, and it's also going to require significantly partnerships with all of our state and federal partners and community groups across Massachusetts and across the country. So we recognize that community engagement is critical in these efforts. And just want to shout out our very talented folks like Marcus Holmes, Megan Davran and EPD, and Jessica Friedman and ETD, who've spent so much time on community engagement efforts. We also have a tireless community engagement division that's expanding and hiring currently in Springfield, and in all of our regional offices, really focusing on making sure that we're hearing voices from across the state. We also host monthly environmental justice advocacy calls. We meet with community groups across the state in person, and we host listening sessions in our office with community groups and community representatives, where there's bureau representation and also exec representation as well. And this feedback it's not just listening, although the listening is critical, it's actually incorporating what we're hearing into our work. So it's helped us generate community responsive supplemental environmental projects in many of our enforcement cases. And we've also been thinking really creatively in the last few years about ways to empower communities to bring us cases and ways to provide information that communities can use to understand their pollution burdens, for example. So for example, in New Bedford, we recently partnered with the New Bedford High School and the New Bedford Community Health Center to produce idling awareness videos that help get the word out about idling and how dangerous it is, but also help guide folks on how to use our idling tip form. We have an idling tip form on our website to provide us tips so we can go out and investigate and potentially bring cases. And we've had several cases, several idling cases based on that. We also helped fund with some settlement money an air monitoring network in the Pioneer Valley. That of course has been particularly important to folks this summer, but it provides real-time publicly available information from dozens of air monitors across that valley, that region. We want to, so I want to also just turn to the topic of stakeholder advocacy. This is a project that ETD has really taken the lead on. We all know, and we've heard today, that energy proceedings are often just incredibly dense and inaccessible. They're verging on incomprehensible for someone like me who's spent her whole life in environmental regulations, and I still have trouble with it. But they lead to very, very impactful decisions that affect people's daily lives, affect people's pocketbooks, where infrastructure is located and how much it costs and who pays for it. So ETD, has submitted comments to the DPU and to the EFSB in the public participation proceedings, has submitted multiple sets of comments to FERC advocating for enhanced public participation before FERC. But the ETD team also realized that that wasn't enough. We need to have voices, or to amplify voices that are representing those who are often left out of the conversation. We need them to make concrete recommendations, and we need to listen to what those recommendations are and get the word out. So we have played a role in convening a stakeholder working group, of which NCAN is a member, and we've helped publicize its findings and will continue to do so. The report was released this spring, and I'll just walk here. There it is, John. Thank you. I'll just briefly walk through some of the recommendations. So the stakeholder the stakeholder working group, excuse me, says, recommends that the DPU and EFSB should open generic policy investigations to revisit regulation in response to the recent Climate Act, provide plain language summaries of decisions, be required to respond to stakeholder comments, that's really important, provide more educational resources, ensure that transcripts of hearings are free and easy to access. And there are some more in there as well. I really commend the report to you. We are so grateful in our office, and our ETD team is so grateful for the time and care that people have put into these recommendations. This work has been really important for our staff, and we've adopted some of the recommendations in public filings as well. We're also coordinating meetings between the stakeholder working group and important elected representatives across the state. So finally, I just want to briefly note some of the extensive, it's been extensive, particularly during the Trump years, litigation and policy advocacy that will continue to do. Examples, the approach, right? It's important to bring new clean energy online, to do so equitably, but it's also really important to ensure that older, dirtier resources reduce emissions or go offline, ideally. And we have to use all the tools in our toolbox to do this. So on the state incentive side of things, we have opposed publicly expansion of state subsidies for biomass energy. And we've advocated for taking biomass out of the RPS, which was ultimately done. We need to be sure, on the biomass subject, that we're subsidizing clean renewable energy and not energy that's bad for communities, surrounding communities, and bad for the climate ultimately. On the federal side of things, just a couple examples. During the Trump years, we tirelessly worked to try to defend, former environmentally protective regulations and to fight rollbacks, which were prevalent. And now we're trying to sort of be helpful on the rebuilding, but in particular to emphasize the environmental justice implications of proposed rules and federal actions. And so I'll just give a couple of examples. I think the Inflation Reduction Act is a particularly helpful place where we've weighed in. We've led a large group of multi-state partners in advocating that the IRS, which is largely tasked with implementing the Inflation Reduction Act's enormous tax incentives. We've advocated that the IRS include more robust community engagement in its implementation, and also some enforcement and compliance mechanisms. For example, ensuring that companies that are claiming prevailing wage or apprenticeship requirements, or incentives, are actually complying with those, so that we know that the jobs that we're getting from the Inflation Reduction Act are actually well-paying green jobs. And this spring, we also led comments to EPA on its $3 billion environmental climate justice block grant program with concrete recommendations on meaningful participation and ensuring that those grants get into the hands of community organizations and actual community members. So finally, I know I'm at time here. In the spirit of public participation, I just wanted to note an outstanding current open comment period at EPA on EPA's proposed power plant rule. So this is taking the place of the former Clean Power Plan and then the ACE rule under the Trump administration. And this proposed rule proposes to set the standard for regulating those power plants based on carbon capture and sequestration and co-firing with hydrogen. EPA has recognized that there are potential EJ concerns with this approach. Specifically, they cite the potential to prolong the life of this infrastructure in frontline communities, and also, requiring installation of new infrastructure to, for example, move CO2 offsite. It also doesn't cover peaker plants, which can be more polluting than baseload units. So we are putting together multi-state comments, again, led by our office, New York and California, and our office is really focused on the environmental justice implications of this rule. And we want to hear from people on that subject. So, please let us know, but also please comment. The deadline's still open and it closes on August 8th. So I will turn it back to Logan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Turner, for those incredible comments and for being here. I also want to give a shout out, to the stakeholder working group, which, has been just such an incredibly positive experience, and really has put forward some wonderful recommendations that we can and should be taking. And I want to thank the Attorney General's office and in particular Jessica Friedman for her support in working to establish the stake, or to guide the stakeholder working group forward. I also want to conclude our remarks by passing it over to another member of that stakeholder working group, which is John Walkey from Greenroots. And John is the director of Waterfront and Climate Justice Initiatives at Greenroots, which is a community-based organization dedicated to improving and enhancing the urban environment and public health in Chelsea and surrounding communities. He's an East Boston resident, almost said Eastie there, East Boston resident who has been committed to the work of the Chelsea Creek Action Group for the past 15 years, and the movement for environmental, climate, and transportation justice for that time as well. I also want to say him and Greenroots has been a fantastic partner and a wonderful leader in this space. So thank you for being here, John, and take it away.
Thank you, Logan. And thank you, MCAN and Prince Lobel for hosting this, and for all the previous speakers who've brought up a lot of great issues. I want to try to, and obviously bringing up a lot of what's being done, a lot of positive things, and as is my want to do, I want to bring us all down with why we have to do them in the first place, but then switch to the positive part as well. And actually, I'm just going to read off a line from some testimony just given that I gave at the telecommunications, utilities, and energy hearings that were done at the Disjoint Committee a couple of weeks ago. And so Greenroots is, for over 100 years, our communities, Chelsea and East Boston, have been home to a lot of the region's energy infrastructure facilities. And we've borne a substantial environmental and health burden from that, from power plants, oil terminals, high voltage substations, transmission lines, among other facilities. And we have sort of fallen backwards into the whole siting process. And that started for me personally before I was actually working at Greenroots, just as an East Boston resident, getting involved in something almost 10 years ago now, where somebody said, hey, do you want to be a limited participant? And I thought that sounded like fun. Yeah, sure, why not? And little did I know I would suddenly be embroiled in a decade-long fight against an electrical substation in my neighborhood. Through that whole process, it really opened our eyes to the Energy Facility Siting Board of its existence and how it works and how it really fails communities. What we saw was an inadequate system in need of reform, from the complete opacity of the process to the failure to provide proper public notice or language access, project justifications that were based on proprietary data sets that were sealed off from public scrutiny or third-party review, the complete lack of any consideration of community needs, the cumulative impacts, complete lack of consideration of cumulative impacts on an already overburdened environmental justice communities, and a failure to assess projects in light of climate change impact concerns and the need to design our electrical grid for a new century. And all of that was just in one case. And it's very interesting that a lot of my colleagues in the grassroots movement are fighting things. I think some of them have been mentioned, peaker plants, gas pipelines, a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure. And people look at me and they say, John, you're fighting a substation. I mean, it doesn't have smokestacks. When it's set up, it's going to support electrification in the community. And in fact, the project proponent says, we are denying an environmental justice community access to this new economy of green energy if we don't build this. And I had to try to defend myself and say, why don't we want this? And there are aspects in terms of climate change, building on a coastline that's going to flood within the lifetime of a substation is one of those concerns. But one of the things that came up again and again, our attorneys who are working with us, some of which are from Conservation Law Foundation, are in the audience. Other pro bono attorneys that have helped us out kept coming back to look at the enabling legislation for this entity. It's not, nowhere does it say it needs to take into consideration community. Nowhere does it say it really needs to take into consideration climate. And obviously that's a new thing. Goalposts are changing on us pretty rapidly. So there is this need for reform in terms of what we now know needs to be taken into consideration. And in the situation of looking at an electrical substation, one of the biggest concerns was, and answering the question that other people have, don't you want this for electrification of homes and such, was the answer of, is this the kind of investment, $106 million and counting dollar investment, is that the kind of investment we really want to make in our grid for the 21st century? It might have been the investment we wanted to make 50, 60 years ago. However, going forward, do we want just another transformer of high voltage energy into lower voltage distribution level, or would we rather see a grid that can more dynamically manage distributed generation, distributed storage that may or may not be behind meters? We need to look at our electrical grid, and this is where it gets a little bit beyond just the Energy Facilities Siting Board, which has a very, they have marching orders. And we need, and I see some of the folks in the audience are with me on the Fix the Grid campaign that Slingshot and others have been working on, where we're looking at ISO New England and where our investments go. And I think when we start talking about that, we don't want to get into this argument that taking into consideration environmental justice communities, histories of oppression, of racist, systemic racism, histories of just dumping on certain zip codes. We don't want that to slow down electrical infrastructure. We don't want that to slow down renewable energy. However, we don't want the new energy sector to repeat the mistakes of the past. When you look at the states that have the most solar and the most wind, they are the liberal hotbeds of Texas and Oklahoma and places like that, where the implementation of renewable energy is being done within pretty much the same framework that oil derricks were put up, except now they're solar panels or wind turbines, but it's the same sort of system. And that system really can use high voltage substations and transmission lines. And wouldn't you know, our regulatory system is set up for them to make the maximum amount of money doing that. And the whole reason why we haven't had a whole lot of distributed solar or that there's inertia to getting into a lot of distributed solar and energy generation and battery storage is that we haven't figured out the business model that makes sense for the people who are controlling things at this moment. And so when we look forward, we really do need to consider some of those things as we think about a just transition to this green economy. And as Richard said, we should not think about community participation slowing things down. And in fact, we had a industrial level battery storage company come to Chelsea and reach out to us and talk to us about putting in a facility here. We had a great conversation and we're supportive of it, and it's going in. So it's not that the slowdown in this process is not community participation. It's not environmental justice. That has never really slowed much down when it comes to environmental justice neighborhoods. What slows us down is the existing regulatory framework, which is not set up for climate, and it's not set up for a new grid that could really present benefits, not only to investors in certain companies, but to communities that have been excluded from those benefits for so many years and have borne the burden of the previous setup for so many years. So there's really a lot of opportunities here. And the last thing I will just stop here so we can get into questions and conversation is that I do want to give another plug for the report. It's backwards, I guess. Overly impacted, rarely heard. The AGO's office has been doing great work pulling this stuff together. The last couple of years, we've been putting together again and again the same recommendations. And this document really brings a lot of that all together within the context of siting reform. I highly recommend downloading it. I think the link is in the chat. Check it out. It's definitely where we want to go. It's where we want to see the EFSB incorporate some of these things. And we want to see the DPU likewise follow suit. And I think with this administration, we have the chance to really move some of that. But it's going to take all of us pushing, because there are forces pushing on the other side as well. I'll stop there. Back to you, Logan.
Thank you so much, John. That was a great way to close out the initial portion. You know, and kind of really emphasizing that, you know, community engagement, environmental justice does not slow this down. So I know we are a little bit over time, but I do want to bring everyone back for a panel discussion. And I'm going to try to get through a few questions, though I know some of them are quite in depth. So I'm going to try to go through 2 or 3. And I'm just going to wait to make sure everyone gets up here before we begin. And so I think the first one, John, I'm going to go to you first, and you know, would love to kind of hear reactions from other folks, but it does get into that community engagement. You know, you just talked about how there is, you know, examples of effective community engagement with clean energy, and that, you know, that is a useful way forward. And as we look at this at a macro level, you know, that need for dialogue between a wide variety of stakeholders is incredibly clear. And so the question is, how do we do this effectively at a macro level? And how can we ensure that communities are empowered and adequately considered as that dialogue is being had? You know, not just, you know, we've you know, ticked off this box, but that they're actually being adequately considered and the voices are being heard. So I'll go to you, and then I'd love to hear from folks who are working on this, you know, in other ways. Take it away, John.
Sure. I guess, you know, we feel a little bit like we've not only reinvented the wheel, but we've sort of got an assembly line production of wheels that have been going on as we've been talking to the EPA, at the municipal level, at the city of Boston, talking to everybody and saying some of the basic, the appendices in this report actually begins to make a good best management practices for community outreach. Things like figuring out what time of day you do your public meetings, figuring out what languages are spoken in those communities and making sure you've got interpreters there, making sure that any documents you hand out in English, you've got those things translated into the other languages. And then in the issue of language, plain English is fantastic, especially in this sector, because it is incomprehensible sometimes. And as we look at impact analyses, you have to be a traffic expert, a energy expert, a water expert, so many different fields. We really do need to have kind of a source of information to train people up in sort of a popular education model, so that they can, because people are capable of understanding this stuff if it's presented in a way that's intelligible to them. And then I think the big thing, and I noticed it in the chat, for the EFSB and citing reform, is looking at the whole thing about intervener status, that you need to have a lawyer there with you. Well, not all communities are going to have that kind of money. Not all people are just even going to know that they need a lawyer there, and they just sort of jump in thinking their voice is going to do something, but within an adjudicatory process, doesn't work that way. So we really need to address some of those things. And I think the agencies are pulling together a lot of these recommendations, as I said, into like a best management practices kind of volume for this.
That's a great way to get us started. I'm curious if there's anyone who'd like to add on to John's comments.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing that we're thinking about is, in terms of engagement and meaningful engagement, is how do we do that on the front end and not when there's pushback, right? Like, how do you engage people not when things are getting approved, but way before, right? Like at the very beginning, because, you know, if we factor engagement and the feedback, we will actually be able to incorporate some of the feedback into the projects. Is this location better than the other? Is this, could it look differently? What are the alternative options? I think that there is a way to have a meaningful impact in these decisions if we have those meaningful conversations early on. And they might be, if you factor that into your business model, it might be worth it in avoiding a 10-year fight, right? Or avoiding a long multi-year fight. So I think that's part of the sort of key is this engagement cannot start when things are being approved or, you know, a month or 2 months before things are up for approval. Because like John said, a lot of the times there's a lot of work that needs to happen in order to get folks up to speed. And just in terms of the plain English, you know, it's not about dumbing it down or making it, you know, for first grade level or second grade level, because I think a lot of times that could be perceived as offensive for immigrant communities who don't speak English. It's more about, like John said, if you have I don't know, a PhD in economics, they still would not be able to understand, right, all of these acronyms and systems and the language that is used. So I do think that the plain English, as well as starting early on before projects are sort of, you know, up for approval will avoid and mitigate a lot of the impacts.
That is really helpful. And I saw, Richard, you came unmuted, and I know one of the stakeholders, you know, that has to be included in the discussion is municipalities. So, you know, I'd love to kind of hear, and I know you represent some municipalities in this work, so I'd love to kind of hear your reaction to this from that perspective, as well as a general reaction as well.
I think there are two things that need to be reinforced here. One is, and I agree, the need for meaningful dialogue, discussion early in the process is important. And that can go a long way. I was so heartened to hear about the storage facility and the discussions on the front end that John had mentioned. But the other part of it is, in addition to those discussions, given that there's some regulators in the room and policymakers, there needs to be a way to compel that any type of development and the developers, utilities, listen to the comments that are made early on. Our experience has been, unfortunately, we can have a lot of meetings, and they're required to have a lot of meetings. There's pages and pages of meetings and the FSB citing proceedings that are referenced as, hey, look, we had all these meetings. The problem is that there's no meaningful discussion, consideration of opposing points of view. So when you get to the hearings, you had the meetings, but no one listened. And I can recollect in certain cases that we had 4 or 5 meetings with stakeholders and municipalities about a project and an alternative that would have, if it was accepted, allowed a project to proceed very quickly, but it was rejected. And so it went to litigation and actually went to the SJC. It took longer than it should have. And it was all about not listening to municipalities, not listening to stakeholders. So that process needs to be improved to compel that kind of listening on the part of developers and utilities.
I think that's great, Turner, or Turner, I'll go to you, and then Melissa.
Sure, I couldn't agree more with Chief Power, or excuse me, Undersecretary Power and Richard's comments. I think I heard an analogy recently that really stuck with me that I just want to repeat here, which is Professor Stephen Gardner he's a professor of ethics, and he has this model where he says, you know, you don't build a house and then put the plumbing in. Right? It's talking about the ethics and the equity, and you don't come in at the very end and try to, you know, put the plumbing in the walls. It has to be there from the very beginning. And he goes on to say, actually, really, it should be more of the foundation. Right. And he's saying it's ethics, it's community sentiment, it's community needs, it's like understanding the cumulative impacts and the burdens that these communities are facing before you go in, before you have a proposal, before the writing's on the wall. And so just figuring out how can we do that in every instance, in every possible place. And I want to point to, you know, DEP has proposed new cumulative impact regs that have an interesting model for having early notice. And I think the more the early notice requirements, early comment periods, early input, the better.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit, speaking from my federal experience for a moment. You know, when I was in General Counsel's office, one of the activities that OGC led was going back through EPA's prior publication on EPA authority to consider environmental justice in implementing federal environmental statutes. And that's a good resource. It's available and publicly available now. And you know, that really gets at this issue too of like the difference between the process and the substance, because I think we've gotten very, very good at studying the impacts on environmental justice communities. I think you've seen the analysis of that improve quite a bit. While it's not perfect, I think there's been a sea change in process improvements, you know, at least a pretty robust recognition of the need to ensure engagement in these processes and moving towards, you know, even like I think we used to call it a green Gideon, the idea that, you know, there should be some fund at the DPU that would actually pay for folks to come in with a lawyer and whatever experts they need. So I think we've seen that up, but like at the end of the day, if it doesn't change the actual decision, then that process isn't working. So I think that's where I think we're really hoping that we will distinguish. And, you know, Undersecretary Power and I are both, you know, leading what are effectively our largest cross-cutting initiatives across this administration, because EJ touches everything that we do and climate touches everything that we do. So we have a lot of conversations, and I think, you know, there's part of the same dynamic with it, which is, you know, like really embedding it in how we think about these things. So I wanted to make that point because I think it's really important, and I wanted to also just make the point that there are overarching, aside from the environmental statutes and the authority that they may provide and the state statutes to consider environmental justice, there is the overarching obligation under Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act that when the states are administering programs that are supported by federal dollars, they may not result in either intentional or disparate impacts. And so you've seen an increase, particularly under Administrator Reagan's tenure at EPA, an increase in the number of complaints that are coming into EPA from advocacy groups in the states. For example, you may have seen EPA's work around a couple of parishes down in Louisiana a year or so ago. And, you know, that was a complaint that came in from Tulane and many citizen groups effectively saying, look, the way the state is administering its air permitting program is resulting in disparate environmental impacts. And so EPA took a very, very hard look at that. And there are a number of those claims coming in now. So that's just a compliment to, you know, think about all the time. Like there is always this backdrop of civil rights laws that prohibits disparate impact and disparate treatment. And I would just put that out. And it's the last thing I wanted to say is completely another topic. But John was talking a little bit about, you know, comparing our current composition, our fuel, you know, the pie chart of where all of our fuels are coming from right now. And we're still around 60% natural gas for generating our electricity here. And, you know, I look at a bunch of data, but I had seen this summary last week. It was basically saying, you know, in April of this year, you had Kansas and Iowa and Vermont both generating electric with over 80% clean power. So, you know, like, why is that? Well, you know, like Vermont's got all this hydropower, we don't. You know, the big wind facilities and solar out in Kansas and Iowa, I'm pretty sure these are directly connected to the transmission system. And here we are in a state that has had many, many lessons to learn from some pretty significant policy failures around how we incentivized clean energy. You know, we sort of had, you know, a huge build out of solar, for example, which is fantastic, but sometimes that solar is not built around interconnection. Harvard has just come out, Harvard Forest has just come out with its wildland study. And if I remember the number right, you know, like, because it's easy to build, it's like 60% of it is ground mount solar in a forest. And that's not what we want to end up with. So we really have to look and be more, and this is what I think will come out of the Siting Commission with their recommendations. We actually need some comprehensive planning around it. Like, where do we want this stuff to go? How do we want to incentivize it? What does it need to be? It needs to be, you know, close to interconnection services. It needs to be not in environmental justice communities if we can afford that. We need to be thinking about impacts on aquifers. We need to be thinking about the impacts on our other goals of sequestering carbon from our sinks like forests. So the coordination of these things is really important. And I guess the thing to leave with is like now the administration's been very intentional about putting people like Undersecretary Power in their position, or me and my colleagues in my position, to think about this stuff in a systems way. And you've got, Secretary Tepper, who comes with like decades of siting experience, to think about this stuff in a systems way. So that's what we're trying to do at this point. And I would just say, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a 6 to 8 year delay in interconnection right now. So think about how that is affecting project economics for some of these projects that we need yesterday, we need 10 years ago. So we're all very aware of this. We're very aware of the need for more regional coordination on building the transmission too. That's a huge priority as well. And I guess, this is all to say, like, these are interrelated, large scale problems that need, policy fixes. And we're very committed to doing that. And we realize, I want you to understand that we realize that we get the critical importance of fixing these things in order to meet our clean energy and climate change goals. Like, I will just add one final point to this, which is, you're thinking about all these things that can affect what you're doing. I want to just turn back to the climate bank for a moment. So like, two big barriers that everybody would think of are, how are you going to pay for this housing decarbonization? And do you have enough workers to do it? Well, hopefully the climate bank is designed to do that, and to, be poised to leverage some of the EPA greenhouse gas reduction fund money that's going to be coming through, and to receive other kinds of money from private sector and from, potentially philanthropy or maybe even impact investment. So, okay, we've got some ways to bring some money to the table. We've got a bunch of plans in place with Secretary Tutwiler. We put an innovation pathway in place so that there's money going to some schools so that kids can learn how to work on an HVAC unit, and they know how to put it in, they know how to repair it, they know how it works. We need that happening, to amplify that through our schools. We've been talking with unions and others about how to close that gap. It's a 40,000 person gap in the workers that we need across the board for clean energy transition. And then like, let's assume we have all that. Now, let's just look at where we're going to put this. And if we want to be aiming at environmental justice communities, places where we've got low income housing, well, guess what? Those happen to be the places that have the most distribution grid congestion. So I just had a tutorial, about a week ago from DPU, helping me understand how to look at those congestion maps. And that's a problem because, as Richard was saying, but you said triple, I think, right? The estimates are we're going to double, triple, our demand for clean energy, for electricity as we do this clean energy transition. Well, you got to make sure that when you put in 200 units of housing retrofit that have heat pumps on, when you flick the switch, there's actually going to be enough power. So that requires coordination with the utilities. That stuff's expensive. And because of Ukraine war, because of COVID, we've got a 1 to 2 year manufacturing delay on just getting the transformers. So, this is all to say, like, this stuff is, I'm just trying to bring some detail and flavor to you about how complicated some of this stuff is. So, that requires a lot of partnering now with utilities to make sure when we build this stuff, they're actually going to be able to meet the new demand. Thanks.
I so appreciate that, Chief Hoffer. And I think, it does really capture the magnitude of the challenge, as well as the opportunity that we have before us, and the steps that the administration is taking, the Attorney General's office is taking, and environmental justice or communities are taking to move forward. And I think, that this is the next step, dialogue, while also, building the ship while we fly it. And so I want to just highlight here, I know we are about at time, and I want to just highlight that this is the beginning of the discussion. There is still so much more, that we could ask, so much more to be said, and so many other topics to comment on. And I think, this is just one indication of the willingness of the administration, but also other stakeholders to engage. And so I hope that coming out of this, that's exactly what we see. And I'm glad that MCAN can be a part of it. And I want to thank our incredible panelists for being a part of this initial discussion. I also want to thank Prince Lobel for your partnership in this. And I want to pass it over to you, Richard, if there are any final comments you'd like to share.
Thank you, Logan. I just want to say how amazing it was to have so much information put out to so many people in such a short time on an incredibly important topic. I share Logan's enthusiasm that this is the beginning of a process, and I'm optimistic that this administration, the Attorney General, and all the brain power that's reflected in this community, as shown on the Zoom call here, will be able to resolve and solve the problems that we have to solve in order to stop the planet from overheating. PLT, Prince Lobel and Ty, is delighted to partner with MCAM on this. We're happy for such an amazing turnout, and we look forward to the next event. This is the second event we've had with MCAM in the last 2 years, and I look forward to whatever else we decide to put forward next time. So thank you all. Thank you, Logan.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you all so much for joining us today. As you exit, we did just want to put up a slide. I know that there are some other governmental contacts, but in the event that you want to get in touch with PLT or MCAN, these are some of the ways you can contact us. And I want to just again thank you all so much. Thank you to our fabulous group of speakers for your expertise and for sharing that with us here today. And I hope everyone has a wonderful Thursday afternoon.
Thank you, Logan.